In this video, we will be covering some of the strangest and darkest mysteries that range from unsolved murders, missing people's cases, serial killers, archaeological, historical, and geographical mysteries. As always, grab a drink. My choice today is chai tea, or just chai, I guess, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries iceberg. And just quickly before you begin, if you like the look of these mugs, they are all official, unique designs for Connor's Curiosities, available in the shop in the link down below. You can kill two birds with one stone, you get some awesome looking merch, and you support the channel at the same time. We've also got hats, as you can see sitting on top of my head, and we have also got jumpers with some very cool designs on. The front as well also has a, little logo on. But yeah, we have all sorts on the website. So if you want to support the channel, head over to the link in the description, and the first 6 people who order will get a handwritten letter from yours truly. But for now, let's get back into the iceberg. Zolotaryov's camera is, for me, a mystery from one of the most interesting, intriguing, mysterious cases that I've ever covered. And as you know, if you've followed the channel for a long time, or if you've just scrolled back to some of my older terrible videos, you will know that this is one of the first cases that I ever covered on this channel. That being, of course, the case of the Dyatlov Pass. But I have always, at least since then, wanted to do a full recovering of this case, with more extensive research, maybe some more photos and evidence, cooler lights, better camera, moody, dark background. So hopefully that will happen sometime in the near future. But as a quick summary intro to this case, it involved 10 fairly young hikers, on average between the ages of like 20 and 24, who went on a somewhat dangerous but still fairly standard, well-planned hike in the Ural Mountains in Russia in 1959. And long story short, the group went missing. They didn't turn up when they had planned to turn up, and they weren't located until 2 weeks after they had gone missing. And after they didn't show up, the investigators, the search team went out. They used helicopters, they used searcher dogs, they used just normal human searchers. They went along the normal hike route that the team had planned, and they were in the snow, digging through it. It was super thick snow. They couldn't find any clues, but eventually they did find on the side, or like base of this mountain area, they found a tent sticking up out of the snow. And so they cleared the snow, and inside the tent were none of the hikers, but most of their belongings. And it was a single tent. It was huge. It was supposed to, house 8, 9, 10 people. And inside they found, everything. They found socks, shoes, camping gear, overcoats. They found hiking sticks, hiking gear, food, cameras, survival equipment and tools, and even sleeping bags. And so they thought, okay, these people can't have gone far. Most of them without shoes, without any of their main gear. They must be somewhere around here. And also, they must have left the tent in quite a hurry. These weren't just random kids out in the mountains. They were, although they were, somewhat young, they were like extremely experienced hikers. And so they would have known that going out into the mountains without most of your gear was almost certainly, a death sentence. And so whatever forced them out of the tent must have been absolutely terrifying. So they searched the immediate area. They found a trail of footprints still frozen in the snow, leading down from the tent, down the slope, and ending at a small clearing at the bottom of this slope. This was near kind of the edge of a forest, and there they found more and more clues. They found the remnants of a campfire. They found this large tree which had its branches like broken off up to a certain height. So perhaps they stayed around the tree for shelter. They broke off the branches to try and get some firewood. But here they also found the bodies of 2 of the hikers, Yuri Krivonoshenko and Yuri Doroshenko. Then upon, looking around a bit more, they found Dyatlov himself, who was the leader of the hike, and who the case and the area itself, Dyatlov Pass, was eventually named after. And they found him Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, all between basically the campfire and the tent, suggesting that these three had gone from the campfire and actually made an attempt to climb up to the tent in order to, recover items, maybe recover socks or sleeping bags so they didn't freeze to death. But in this struggle up the hill, in the middle of the night, in the freezing cold, with none of their gear on them, they apparently all ended up collapsing of hypothermia and eventually freezing to death. And so that was it until around 2 months later, when the remaining bodies of Thibaut Brignol, Dubinina, Kolevatov, and Zolotaryov would be found. And this specific entry is referring to the camera that Zolotaryov had on him. It was still around his neck when he died, and it was with him buried in the snow, in the watery, trenched snow, for, at this point, almost 3 months. And there are so many aspects about this case, which, as you can imagine, would take almost an entire video to cover, hence why I want to do a remake of this case. But for now, I will just cover the mystery surrounding his camera. And so his camera wasn't officially listed as an item on this trek. There was an official list, a item itinerary sort of thing of 10 sleeping bags, 4 pickaxes, 37 granola bars, whatever it was that they took with them on this hike. It was all listed in order, as you do, but Zolotaryov's camera wasn't one of these items. It seems like he had just taken it for himself, his personal camera. He didn't have it listed anywhere. And secondly, whatever happened to these people, to this group, that in the middle of the night had forced or, convinced this many highly experienced hikers to leave their tent in the middle of the night, some of them with no socks, no trousers, no shoes. Whatever happened must have been pretty intense. And yet Zolotaryov had some of his clothes on. He was better dressed than some of the others, and he also had his camera on him, which is a weird thing to take in an apparent emergency. And thirdly, we come to the actual footage on the camera, which was, bear in mind, under the water for 3 months, in the freezing, icy, watery, snowy abyss. And so the development of these photos, it wasn't super successful. They were only able to recover partial snippets of the camera film itself. And I feel like some of these images are kind of like raw shot plots, where, they're vague enough to kind of represent something, whatever your mind goes to. There's definitely no crystal clear images in here, but for example, this one of the, researchers for this case, one of the investigators, they think that this might originally have been or represented something like this, which, as you can see, depicts kind of a nighttime scene with a campfire with unidentified men attacking the group, holding them down at gunpoint. And so if you believe this, then perhaps there was a kind of darker explanation as for why these people were all out of their tent. And so there are theories about, these people stumbling upon some secret service meeting or some secret bunker, out in the middle of Russian mountains run by the KGB or, Cold War style or whatever, that was top secret, that they shouldn't have seen, and that they were killed for seeing it. As I said, there's a lot more detail in a full covering of this case, but some of the injuries that these people suffered from were stuff like a broken chest. The autopsy described it as like they were hit by a car or something. And so there's some theories that there was some cryptid that killed them, a yeti sort of creature. Other injuries were like a snapped neck, a broken collarbone, a smashed head, which some people think is evidence of, KGB style killing. A lot of the hikers also had some traces of radiation on their clothes, which people have linked to either aliens, as that seems to be commonly found in alien abduction cases, or to, they stumbling upon something they shouldn't have seen sort of angle. Maybe it was a nuclear facility or something and there was nuclear radiation all around. They went through it, they shouldn't have seen it, and so they were followed and that night forced out of their tent killed and made the whole thing to look like an accident. Let me know your thoughts on this one, as it is a very interesting case, I think. There are a fair amount of photographs taken of the crew, of their hike, and it might very well have been something like, you know, an avalanche or an ice or a snowfall, you know, sliding down the mountain, kind of crushing the tent, but they see it as it's coming down the mountain, so they get out of the tent before it comes down. That could always be an explanation, but as I said, let me know what you think of this one down below. I'm not even sure what to call this one. I don't even think the title knows what it's called, but this was the name of an album of something called vaporwave, which is a type of music. It's very chill. I'll play some in the background. Props to the artist for letting me, you know, use his track. Check out his other stuff down below. But this album in particular, sometimes called, you know, nothing, like literally just two quotes back to back, sometimes with nothing in between them, sometimes with a space, or sometimes these 6 question marks, is a piece of lost media of an album made by an artist called Quadratox. And this was many, many years ago. It was sold one time. Like, there's only one copy apparently of this album, and it was sold in a physical CD, custom made by Quadratox himself, that, as you can see, was very unique. It was melted, it had the symbol X kind of on the front, on the back, and it included a single key from Quadratox's keyboard, which he says helped him make all of this music. And this album, this sale, was listed on his Bandcamp, with him noting that this is the saddest thing I ever made. He says it's a vaporwave / ambient improvisation recorded on the 9th of the 3rd, 2018. Thanks for that date format, Americans. He says this CD is the penultimate chapter of Quadratox's discography and is the key to understanding all of my work. Who will buy the CD will be free to upload where it wants. Tracklist 1, which is also called question mark, goes on for 20 minutes 40 seconds. Tracklist 2, again question mark, very mysterious, goes on for 20 minutes 41 seconds. And then he says the CD case has been burnt down with a lighter and inserted a key of my keyboard of my PC that has accompanied me throughout my journey. He then goes on to list all of the programs and technology he used to create this music, you know, create this album. And then it says limited to 1 CD, and at the bottom, my depression is destroying me, and this is the result. And since then, the website and all of the information about this post, about the album, have seemingly been taken offline, with this page only remaining accessible thanks to the Wayback Machine. And so we don't really know what was on the CD or on the album. We don't know who the one person was that ended up purchasing it, and no trace of it or the person has ever been found or seen since. aXXo, or aXXo, was a very cool early internet vibe sort of individual, or might have actually been a group, because aXXo was the name of, you know, someone or some people who began sharing pirated movies, originally on the message board DarksideRG. And this was all the way back in the 2005 era, and basically his movie rips slowly started to become famous just because of how consistent they were. They were reliable, high quality, never had glitches or viruses or anything, and they were just big enough to put on a CD. So very convenient. It was just like the champagne of the pirating world, you know, the Dom Perignon of illegal blockbuster movies. And as I said, he or they started in 2005. They uploaded all the way through to 2007, when they had a bit of a scuff, a bit of a disagreement with some other users, and so they ended up deleting all of their torrents. Then they came back in 2008, eventually working through, you know, uploading their 1000th film rip, and then continued through to 2009 before posting his or theirs final goodbye on the, you know, OG message board DarksideRG. And this was the last time that aXXo was ever heard from ever again. We still to this day don't know who he or they they or her were or was, as people have suggested that it could be one person, some sort of a hacker individual, but it also could have been the name of a small group of, clever people, computer savvy people that were just working together to get these films out for whatever reason. We just simply don't know. But either way, I do absolutely adore these, classical early internet days sort of entries. Mirella Gregori is the tragic case of a 15-year-old girl who went missing from Rome in 1983. And if that sounds familiar, just this kind of case in general, that's because we covered a case just like this just a little while back, that being the case of Emanuela Orlandi, who was also a 15-year-old girl who went missing in Rome near the Vatican, and this was just 40 days after Mirella went missing. But on this day, May 7th, 1983, Mirella was at home when she gets a call on the intercom of the, family home that was apparently from her former classmate, Alessandro. Her mother heard her talking on the intercom, saying, who is this? And then she said, well, if you're not going to tell me who you are, then I'm not coming down to meet you. And then after all of this, she says, oh, it's Alessandro. She said, I'm just gonna have lunch, but I will come and meet you at around 3:30. Then Mirella has some lunch. She puts on some makeup, tells her mum she's going out, down to meet Alessandro, but says she'll be back up in like 10-15 minutes. And that was the last time that her mother ever saw her. But after leaving the house, we know that Mirella went downstairs because they had like a house on top and a bar underneath. So, there was a bar beneath her house. And so after having lunch, putting on makeup, leaving the house, she then went down to the bar and met with her best friend, Sonia DeVito, whose parents ran this bar. And so it was, a common meeting place between the two girls. They would sometimes hang out there. But she went down there. She went to talk and meet up with Sonia. The two girls then went to the bathroom for quite a while to apparently, according to Sonia, talk about woman's things, apparently. And after talking for about 15 minutes, Mirella left the bar, and this was the last time that she was seen by anyone. And after 2 hours of, no word from Mirella, her mother started to get worried. So she called Mirella's sister, who was at the time working in the family bar, just across town. And she also hadn't seen Mirella. So the sister started to do, a bit of searching around, a little bit of an investigation sort of thing. She spoke to Sonia, where she learned that Mirella had told her that she had an appointment at Porta Pia, which was the location that Mirella would apparently meet Alessandro in. So it seems like she had arranged with Alessandro to meet at Porta Pia. According to some versions of this testimony, she was going there to play guitar, and it would later be noted that Mirella herself couldn't play guitar, nor could any of her friends, so this was seen as a bit strange. But obviously, receiving this information, Mirella's sister then went to the park in Porta Pia, and she said it was, kind of run down almost. There was basically no one there, especially not Mirella. And so the next logical thing would be for her to contact Alessandro. And eventually they did get through to Alessandro through different contacts, and they found from him that he wasn't the one that buzzed on her door that day. In fact, he said he hadn't seen Mirella in almost 2 years. So who the hell was it that rung on their family intercom, that said or pretended to be Alessandro, and who apparently met up with Mirella on that day? And the answer to that, sadly, is we don't really know. And although these two cases of these two missing girls were fairly similar, they were the same age, both Italian, both around Vatican City, both basically around the same time, there is even less evidence for this case than there was in the Emanuela case. Like in this case, there were very, very few witnesses. Mirella hadn't really been witnessed by anyone, in particular, either leaving the bar or where she walked or where she was or where she ended up. And as far as suspects go, there was Alessandro, obviously, is probably the main suspect, but he was very quickly cleared up. What he was saying seemed to be at least mostly true. He hadn't visited Mirella, he hadn't seen her in 2 years, he had no idea who might have faked being him, and he seemed to have a fairly solid alibi. So this case, without any evidence, without any leads or suspects, kind of came to a halt, and eventually, with the news of this missing girl, circulating around, eventually the Pope himself met up with Mirella's parents, to maybe comfort them, reassure them, say that Mirella is always in our thoughts and our prayers. And while he was visiting them, Mirella's mother noticed something a little strange. She said that one of the bodyguards of the Pope she recognized as being a regular in her bar, and she said she recognized them as often talking with Mirella herself and with Sonia, her best friend. She immediately, upon seeing this, upon suspecting this bodyguard and deputy chief of basically the Vatican security, she requested an investigation and a face-to-face meeting with him in order to, talk to him, to ask him questions, to get to the bottom of this. But she was only granted this interview or this face-to-face 8 years later, which was in 1993, after she was coincidentally suffering from a severe illness. And at this point, her illness was exhausting her. She was often tired throughout the day. She would sometimes forget where she was or get confused. She would get tired and upset. And so eventually, on this face-to-face meeting, she was asked if she recognized this man, Raul Bonarelli, and her response was basically just I don't know. As I said, her mental state at this point was just absolutely exhausted, just shattered. It was at least 8 years after the initial disappearance. But the investigation basically said, well, since you can't recognize this man, you can't say, you can't attest that he was the man at the bar at the time, then they basically deemed her as uncredible, as confused, even though her daughter said that throughout these years, while they were waiting, her mother was never confused about this. She said, all the time she was convinced absolutely that this man was the man who had been seen in her bar, more or less just before her daughter had gone missing. So that is that part of it. There was also another bit of quite interesting evidence and testimony that was regarding this Italian Secret Service agent who in 1983 noted down that he was investigating the case at Sonia's bar, and while he was there, he overheard Sonia, Mirella's best friend, he overheard her say, "He knew us, but we didn't know him. Just as he took Mirella, he could have taken me too, since we were going together." Which sounds like a bloody important piece of information, if you ask me. Possibly incriminating to someone who was maybe hanging around the bar at the time. But for unknown reasons, this document was either buried or lost or misplaced or whatever, and so it didn't emerge until 2016, a full 33 years after the initial disappearance. But yeah, it is an incredibly sad case which has some horrific implications no matter which way you look at it. Whether this was a planned kind of organized attack or whether it was just someone random, maybe a strange serial killer buzzing on Mirella's door, pretending to be one of her old schoolmates and then kidnapping her when she went to meet him. It's all honestly very terrifying, very scary that two 15-year-old girls in Italy could go missing within just around a month of each other in and around Rome, specifically kind of closer to the Vatican City area, and in more or less, broad daylight. It is still being investigated, but only really lightly, as they're not putting too many resources into this case. There's not too much to go on. There's not much, further evidence or leads or anything. And so sadly, this case will probably remain unsolved, at least until we get a bit more evidence. The Bor Jane Doe was a lady who was found dead and decomposed in the Czech Republic in 2003. And she was found just off the side of a highway in a little forested area, quite badly decomposed, as at the time it was midsummer and she was thought to have been killed somewhere else and then left out here for at least a few days. And as she was a Jane Doe, they weren't able to, to fully identify her, but they were able to figure out a few key things about her. Firstly, they figured that she was likely killed around a week before she was found, then dumped here, so she was killed somewhere else and not at this site. Secondly, they said her legs were somewhat skinny or weak, and so they determined that she didn't really do any physical exercise and that she didn't have an active job, and they even said that there were likely no hills in the area that she lived, because even, I guess, walking around hills, up and down hills every day, she would have developed some leg muscles. So that's a little interesting. Also, due to the shape of her hips, they determined that she hadn't yet given birth, and from her hairstyle and genetic markers, they determined that she was likely of Afro-Caribbean origin and may or may not have been killed in the Czech Republic, as the place it was, the place she was found was kind of on the border between there and Germany. So they said it's also reasonable that she was killed in Germany and then brought over the border in the last few days and then dumped here. So realistically, the kill zone could have been anywhere, 4 or 5 days drive of this area, which is obviously a massive zone. And then to get, further clues about her, they got her dental record, or, a dental read of the body's teeth. And they went to various dentists around the area to see if they recognized her teeth. Any work that might have been done, they asked them, have you done work like this recently? But that was basically a dead end. Then they went to hairdressers, or, salons, who specifically did this type of hair which she had, which, as you can imagine, an Afro-Caribbean hairstyle isn't too popular or too common in the Czech Republic. And so actually very few salons or hairdressers actually do this. But even still, after going to a few of them, none of them recognized this woman whatsoever. And since the Czech Republic doesn't officially have an unlimited prosecution time for murder, it does depend on a few things, whether it's, 10 years or 20 years or unlimited. But in this case, the statute of limitations on this particular killing was 20 years, meaning that it was more or less officially closed in 2023. Meaning, once again, and I've said this dozens of times, meaning that no one will officially ever be prosecuted for this murder, as even if they legally came forward, they said, actually, I killed this woman, I've got video evidence of it, they handed it over to the police wouldn't even legally be able to prosecute them, which I think is absolutely insane for things like murder. I can kind of get behind, closing cases, or at least pausing cases or whatever, if they're quite old, there's not much evidence or details or clues for them anymore, and so you don't really want to waste police resources on them. I can absolutely get that, but at least leave the case open so that if anything does come up in the future, you can still legally prosecute whoever this might be. But as I said, in that 20-year time frame, no further clues came up. No one will ever be prosecuted for this murder, and this particular Jane Doe was never identified. Kelly Disney was a 17-year-old girl who went missing from Newport, Oregon, while kind of hitchhiking, but not really, which will make sense in just a little bit. But Kelly was a senior at the Newport High at the time, and she was dating a guy 3 years her senior named Robert Ellis. And he was an, okay guy. He wasn't perfect. There was nothing too bad about him. He was just, a bit irresponsible when it came to drinking and partying. No massive aspirations for his life. Honestly, probably just like most 20-year-olds, to be honest. So nothing too unusual there. But he, at the time, offered for Kelly to move in with him. And she wanted to herself, but her parents were more or less against it. And so she threatened her parents, saying that if you don't let me move in with him, I'm just gonna run away, which seemed to work, I guess, because they did allow this. Kelly did move in with him. And so they said, yes, you can do this just as long as you finish high school. So far, so good. But one night on the 8th of March, 1984, the couple were having this small gathering sort of thing, small party at their apartment. And bear in mind, Robert liked to party a little more than Kelly did. And so they were at this party, they were hosting, people, friends, and suddenly he just got up and left. And this seemed to annoy Kelly. You know, he seemed to be the one that arranged the party. He wanted it more than she did, and yet he just left her at the party going somewhere. We don't know where he went, whether it was out to meet other friends or go down to the shops and get more alcohol or whatever. But the point is, he didn't tell Kelly. He seemingly just abandoned her. This really annoyed her, and so eventually, by the time he came back to the house, a few of his friends told him that Kelly had just left. They said, yeah, we don't know where she went. She just got annoyed at you. She up and left, walked out of the house. And so then Robert went out to look for her. He eventually found her. She had just kind of left the house and walked down the road, I guess. And this was all at around 12:30 at night. So eventually he did find her. She was standing out on her own by Highway 20 in, you know, basically a huff. She said, you left me, you abandoned me, just go away, I don't want to talk to you. He stopped the car, he tried to get her to get into the car. He said, this is ridiculous, you're out here on a cold night, it's, you know, past midnight. But still, she refused to get in the car. So eventually, Robert just decided to drive off, and a few minutes later, she was spotted by these two men driving in their truck, and they were two janitors driving to, you know, their early shift at work. So they stopped, they said, you know, do you want to lift anywhere? It's a bit dangerous being out here. You're on your own by the side of the road on a cold night. But she also refused these two men. So they drove away. They decided to stop a little bit later. They saw a police officer and they told him, like, look, there's this girl on the side of the road. She doesn't seem too safe. She might be in danger. Can you, like, drive by or something? And he personally didn't drive by, but he basically put out a call to, you know, other policemen in the area. A deputy sheriff ended up picking up the call, and he drove by and found her still by the side of the road. So he basically says all the same things, you know, it's the middle of the night, it's freezing, can I drop you off anywhere? It's not safe. And she says, I'll be fine, I'm going to a friend's house, you know, a girlfriend's house. I'm just gonna walk there, it's like literally just here, I'm just going there. Or she was being picked up or something. And so I guess she convinced the police officer of this, but it ended up being completely untrue. I guess she just wanted to be left alone by everyone. Then around 10 or 15 minutes after this, Robert heads out again to try and convince Kelly to come home with him, and by this point Kelly is nowhere to be seen. So he basically continues to look around. He gets eventually some of his friends to do a search, and they're searching the streets, they're searching other friends' houses, you know, calling around, but it seemed that she had just completely vanished. And so the next morning, after not hearing from her all night, her parents then went round to Robert's house and they said, you know, like, where's Kelly? He said he didn't know that she ran away, basically disappeared the previous night, and he said that he assumed that Kelly had gone back to her parents' house. So both the parents and the boyfriend both at the time assumed that Kelly was at, you know, the other's house. So Kelly's dad immediately then filed a missing persons report and a official search was started. And initially police thought that, well, you know, Kelly isn't maybe the most well-behaved of 17-year-olds. You know, she was a bit rambunctious, a bit rebellious maybe. She had already threatened the parents with running away. And so they said, as with seemingly a lot of these cases, that just relax a little bit. It's, you know, quite likely probably that she just ran away somewhere or she was staying at a friend's house. But still, they carried on the search. They searched in, you know, fields and roads, and they put up flyers and they handed out posters, or the other way round. And it was never really a massive search, like not as big as some of the cases we've already covered. And this was partly because she was deemed more likely to have run away, partly because she was 17 at the time, and partly just because they, you know, didn't have as many people. There was hardly any clues, almost nothing to go off. And so at the time, that was more or less it. That was until fast forward 10 years later, or actually more than 10 years, when a man just walked into the Newport Police Department carrying a human skull, which he said he had found inside an abandoned car wrapped in carpet. And he said he was just out there, you know, driving around the area. He knew this general area and he knew this car for like being, you know, a site which kids, you know, partied at. So it was just like, yeah, abandoned car, and kids would often, go over there. They would have some wacky tobacco. They would be drinking, as 16, 17, 18-year-olds sometimes do. And he said, so I was just in the area, thought I'd take a look around at the abandoned car, and there he found something very strange, and that was this thing wrapped in carpet, and when he opened it up, it was a human skull. So he said, as you do, he took it home, he showed his girlfriend, and his girlfriend said, look, dude, you should really bring that into the police station. Like, it's literally a human skull. And so he said, yeah, okay, fine, whatever. He took it first into the sheriff's office, but he said when he took it in, only the jail section of it was open. So he couldn't, leave evidence or start a case. And they advised him to take it to the Newport office. So he then went over there. He tried to talk to someone there, but he said it was a Saturday, so the police station was kind of closed, which... it's just kind of wild. So he thought, okay, fine, I'll bring it down Monday. And then he took it home, washed it with washing up liquid for whatever reason, likely washing away a ton of evidence, no doubt. And then he placed it casually on top of his TV. And then when Monday came around, he took it off the TV and handed it into the police. So a bit of a wild ride, but what exactly did this skull show? Well, they compared the dental records of Kelly to the, dental analysis of this skull, and they were found to be a perfect match. The skull also showed signs of a blunt force trauma, meaning that obviously whatever happened to Kelly, whatever happened to her that night and over the last few years, it seems very likely that she was abducted, she was killed probably with a blunt force hit to the head. And strangely, this skull was found just days after police had made like a public service announcement reminding the public of the case and saying that they would really like some new evidence around this case. And so, if anyone had any information about it, to call in or to come to the police. And then this skull was found. And also, in regards to that, just a day or two before the skull was found, there were teenagers who were playing around and partying, as I said, in this exact spot, and they said they didn't see anything there. They said for sure, we were there for, a good few hours. We were in and around the area and the car. There was no skull or wrapped up carpet thing there when we were there. So who killed Kelly that night? Who took her? Who picked her up? Why had she gotten into this car as opposed to, any of the other cars that had stopped to help her, to take her, her boyfriend's car, the two janitors, the sheriff? Or was she, as seems probably maybe likely, just hit over the head and forced into this car? How and why was she killed? Where was she disposed of? Where is the rest of her body, as only her skull was found? And even why did they still have her skull? Why was it somewhere out here in the open wrapped in carpet as opposed to being buried 12 feet underground? And also why did they place the skull there just after a public announcement about the case was made? Do they want the attention? Was it like a panic sort of thing? I don't really know. Sadly, as I said, this case was never solved. The rest of Kelly's remains were never found, and we still don't know who abducted her and killed her still to this day. The Pickering Six was an unsolved case involving 6 kids, or young adults, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, who went missing after getting drunk, sneaking into a marina in Pickering, Ontario, and stealing and commandeering a boat. And this all happened in 1995, and Jay Boyle, 17, Chad Smith, 18, Michael Cummings, 17, Danny Higgins, 16, Robert Rumbolt, 17, and Jamie Lefebvre, also 17, all attended a spring break party, and naturally there was drinking involved. The boys had a few, and at around 1 a.m. they were all seen leaving the party and heading out towards the marina. And just before 2 a.m. surveillance cameras at the marina caught a few of the boys in the marina. They had maybe snuck in or climbed a fence or something, and then at around 2:30, which is the perfect time for a dentist appointment, some of the locals heard the sound of a boat taking off from the marina, which they later determined to be these boys having stolen or hijacked a boat fairly similar to this one, which is a 14-foot Boston whaler style vessel, which sounds like a decent size, 14 foot. But really, this was a quite small boat, at least relative to some of the bigger boats, and in the context of it sailing out into Lake Ontario, which can be, in, bad conditions, absolute madness. You can have rough waves, you can have heavy waves, you could very reasonably have conditions within the lake that would absolutely tear apart and destroy this boat, especially if you've got more or less kids driving it. And they were definitely drunk. Maybe they thought, go on a wild ride, start picking up some speed, bouncing on the waves, and then all you really need is one crazy wave during a bounce, and it can send the whole boat, flipping upside down and knocking these boys into the water. And if this did happen, once they're in the water, they're basically as good as dead. In these freezing conditions, it would probably be hard to save anyone from freezing to death, even if they had fallen into the water and then been taken up. Hypothermia would probably set in pretty quickly. But if they were left in the water, they couldn't have survived too long. But I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself. Originally, what everyone knew at the time was that these boys were at a party, they left the party, and then that was kind of it. And by the next day, when these boys couldn't be contacted, they were all seen as missing then. And so in the search around the area, they figured out that one of these boats was stolen. They looked at the security footage, saw the boys going into the marina, and they kind of put two and two together that these boys must have snuck in there and stolen a boat. So they almost immediately changed their search from a land-based search into a water-based search. And they got ships out there, they got the Coast Guard, they had helicopters flying around, but nothing whatsoever turned up except for a single can of gas that had belonged to this stolen boat. There were no bodies, there were no clothes or belongings, there was no sign of wreckage or of any other pieces of the boat itself, besides, as I said, the little gas tank. And I think personally what happened here is pretty obvious. It seems very likely these boys just went on a joyride. They were a little drunk, they didn't really care. It's like, yeah, only live once. Boats. And they took it out into these waters. They ended up crashing it due to these waves or due to them just being drunk and a bit silly, and maybe it capsized, filled with water, killing all 6 of these boys and sinking the boat. But there are some other theories. Obviously, the most reoccurring one is that they were abducted by aliens, with the boats being included in that abduction, or that they went out there for some reason. Maybe they were in the substance smuggling and trading business, and so they went out there into the waters to make a deal. The deal ended up going wrong, and whoever they were going out there to meet ended up killing the 6 boys and sinking their boat, which, I still think the joyride theory is the most likely one, and it's the one that there's probably the most evidence for as well. The other ones are just kind of theories, just hearsay, off the cuff sort of ideas with almost no evidence behind. So it is a very, very sad case. Like, I know these boys are kind of to blame for it, or at least, mostly to blame. Like, they got drunk, they snuck into the marina, they stole this boat, and they chose to go out into the waters in the middle of the night, being probably completely drunk. But it is still tragic to see, 6 boys punished in this way, being freezing to death in the waters of Lake Ontario. And that is all we have time for. As a reminder, guys, if you want to support the channel and you haven't checked out any of these cool mugs, caps, t-shirts, hoodies, mouse mats, all with original official designs done by a real-life human artist with no AI in it whatsoever, then check out the link in the description and probably the pinned comment linking to Connor's Curiosities merch shop. And as a reminder, the next 6 people who order will also receive a handwritten letter from yours truly. So as always, I will see you in the next video. There is 1 video left, I believe, in this tier, which has been a long tier if I'm honest. But after this one more left, then that will complete tier 8, and then we will move on to some more unique icebergs, maybe cover 1 or 2 cases on their own. But to make sure you don't miss any of that, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. And as always, thanks for watching.